All right, so now, today we are looking at the Theaetetus 170A2 to 171C7. This is a more serious attack on Protagoras. So prior to this, the sections before, Socrates has given, he's outlined this flux thesis, this whole metaphysical position that we've seen. Remember what the point is that if you accept the homo mens hera thesis of Protagoras, bang, you slide down and you've got this whole metaphysical system. He's articulated it. Remember the dreamer objection. He's defended it against that. Then Socrates has turned his sort of analytical mind to criticize, to examine this whole flux metaphysics. And he's offered some more or less, kind of trivial criticisms of this thesis, and then admitted that those criticisms were a bit on the trivial side. Now we shift gears, or we take it up a level. And that is, Socrates will offer some more serious criticisms until he eventually refutes the whole. Remember, the whole thing is to refute that knowledge is perception, or episteme is aesthesis. Right? So don't lose track of what we're doing. We're still going after this. So, with this idea of offering a more serious criticism, the more serious attack on Protagoras, part one, because there's going to be a couple of these more serious criticisms in this video. I am looking at one particular criticism which has been referred to in the history of philosophy and commentary on the Theaetetus as the peritrope. And peritrope, it gets its name from this guy, Sextus Empiricus, from which we get the word empirical. We'll look a little bit more at what empiricism and empirical is all about a little later. But Sextus Empiricus was an ancient thinker. We're not going to go into his stuff, but he's centuries after Plato. Nonetheless, back in ancient times, late antiquity, if you like, he commented. He commented on the Theaetetus, so he was has a commentary on it and a variety of things. And this section, he's the one that dubbed it the peritrope, and that just means means table, and trope for turning, like tropos, turning. The peritrope argument, or the table turning argument. Now, this argument, this little section here, is very difficult in a number of ways, and it could very well be, and I suspect it is the case, that the text has been corrupted. Translators play around with it a lot, and if you go back to the original Greek, it's a pretty thorny little mess, to say the least. And so philosophers and commentators will reconstruct the position to make it go out. But nonetheless, shall we say, the spirit of the peritrope is relatively clear. What it's really trying to do, the main idea, is to try and use Protagoras' view, which I mark by this little asterisk, right? The idea of the homo mens hera thesis is to try and turn it back on itself, to try and show that it's self-defeating or self-refuting. And we often use this kind of technique in arguing when we say to a friend, well, if you really think that, and then you show that if someone accepts it, some position, that they can actually end up leading themselves into an absurdity or contradicting themselves. So that's roughly what we mean by an argument that will show that something is self-defeating or self-refuting. Self-defeating and self-refuting are not exactly the same thing, but for our purposes here, just as an introduction to this, we're going to regard them as roughly equivalent, but they're not identical. If we go, and if you choose to, you can go much more deeper into this and look at the differences between self-defeating, self-contradictory, etc., etc. But for right now, I'm just trying to give an overall view. And let's recall something. So the HT, I talked about that, is the homo mens hera thesis, right? That, back to the man is the measure of all things, or if something is true for someone, then or if something is perceived, then it is true for that individual. So this is what is sometimes referred to as Protagorean relativism. So how do you refute this relativism? Now, keep in mind that there's been a little bit of a sleight of hand here by our good friend Socrates. And remember, we originally started with things like perception. So what is true for me in perception, or what is the case for me in perception is true. Like if I perceive a red patch and I say red here now, that's going to be absolutely true. That's going to be of my sensation, but I can be wrong about my judgment, right? If I say, oh, I'm seeing a red patch here now, which is just a statement about my sensations. But then if I make a judgment and say, and that red patch is being caused by something outside my mind, like a splotch of paint on the wall, or a red light or something, or a red lens on a light or whatever, or a sunset. Those are judgments, and those can be wrong. Socrates is lifting it up a little bit, and he's talking about judgments and beliefs here as well, which is going to give us a little hint of where this whole dialogue is going. It's going to lift itself up and out of aesthesis and move over into judgment. So as we hunt for what is episteme, we're actually moving towards judgment. That's getting a little ahead, but just as a little bit of foreshadowing, keep that in mind. So the homo mensura thesis, keep that in mind. Now we're going to move over to this. It seems, and I'm rephrasing this to a certain degree to hopefully make it a little bit clearer. Now, it seems that Q is true. What's Q? Q is represents the statement, people believe that some beliefs are true and some beliefs are false. That seems to be pretty innocuous. If you say, do people think that all beliefs are true or that all beliefs are false? No, they believe, if you go around and talk to people, they would say some beliefs are true, some are false. Seems pretty standard, fairly non-controversial, or quite non-controversial. Okay, so Socrates says, yeah, it seems to be the case that Q is true. So what's really going on in the structure of the peritrope is something like this. Socrates says, well, look, my dear Theaetetus, if you believe that, if you hold this position, HT, the homo mensura thesis, then you're going to run into this problem. You have to deny Q. So if you hold this, agree with this, accept this, then you must deny this. So take this, you're going to have to reject this. But wait a second, this seems to be very non-controversial. It seems that it's true. So you would say, well, wait a second, it's absurd to deny this. Well, if that's the case, then if you think that this is well established and this is not so established, but taking this makes you deny something like this, that seems to be a trade-off you're not willing to make. Right? Taking something that having to reject something that you're quite sure of and embracing something that's doubtful, that you're not totally sure of, then you're going to say, nah, I'm not going to deny Q. And if you say, I'm not going to deny Q, I'm going to hold on to it, well, it must be that what drove me into denying Q, that must be false. So, once again, if you accept HT, you got to deny Q. No, absurd to deny Q, hence HT must be false. This is a very standard structure in an argument, and it even has a nice little Latin name of modus dolens, which is sometimes just roughly translated as denying the consequent. That's the consequent. That's the antecedent. If then, antecedent, consequent, denying the consequent, then the antecedent is false. We use this kind of reasoning every day. It's also sometimes called indirect reasoning or indirect proof, where if you want to show something is false, you look at it, you accept it provisionally, as in if it is the case, then you look at what follows from it, and if things follow from it that are absurd, then you say, see, shouldn't have accepted it in the first place. Like when you say to your friend, well, if you do that, then these terrible things will happen. You sure you want those terrible things? Oh, no, you don't? Well, then don't believe the first thing that we started with. Indirect reasoning, modus tollens, logic in everyday action. All the philosophers did was say how we often reason in a normal, everyday way. We're going to give it a name. We're going to look at it abstractly. So there you go. That's the basic structure of the peritrope here. Relatively non-controversial in terms of its general structure. But as they say, where's the devil? In the details. The question that you want to ask yourself is, how exactly does holding this HT, how exactly does the holding of the homomensurity thesis force me or make me reject Q, right? That's the crux of the issue, right? In other words, how to go from holding HT to denying Q, right? How does that work? You got to give me a story, because all this does is give me a structure. So when you say to your friend, oh, if you have that belief, then these bad things will happen, there's nothing wrong with that structurally. But your friend could say, you know what, I'm not sure if you're right about that these things that I'm holding are going to lead to those bad things. You got to supply the middle part. You got to dig in and give me the details of how you get from one to another. You can't just assume it just follows. So how does this work? How do we go from holding HT to denying Q? That is going to be really where a lot of ink has been spilled, and a variety of ways that scholars have interpreted this. It shows up in the literature as quite an area of disagreement. So we're going to have a look at how this works in some detail, and I'll reconstruct things to help it out. Now, let's think about what we're trying to do here. We're trying to show that, again, the big picture. Don't get lost. The big picture is Socrates is trying to show how Protagoras' relativism, the HT, the homomensurity thesis, gets into trouble with itself, causes grief for itself. Gave you the little structure of how it works. Let's look a little bit at this main idea of how it causes problems for itself. Well, Socrates says, let's look at this in a little more detail. And he offers now, Socrates, he offers a couple of ways to think about it to generate this problematic result. Socrates says, suppose that Protagoras does not embrace HT. Okay, just for the sake of discussion, suppose Protagoras does not embrace HT, and many other thinkers, philosophers, many others do not embrace HT. And that seems to be, at least not this first part, but this part seems to be the case, that many others do not embrace HT. Democritus, a number of other thinkers of the time did not embrace HT. Protagoras, let's suppose he didn't. If that were the case, then what do we have? Then nobody embraces HT. So it's not true for anyone. So in that sense, in that particular case, nobody embraces HT, so HT false. For everyone. All right. Now, it's a little bit of a sleight of hand here, because Socrates does move from many to nobody, right? Because it could be that maybe a couple embrace it here. But Socrates, there's a bit of a slight or a bit of a shift in the text, so it's not clear exactly what's going on. But nonetheless, let's look at sort of the general outline of it. Protagoras does not embrace it, many others don't, so it's really false for everyone. in this case, let's look at the second part, the second kind of case. Suppose now, I'm not going to change this one. I'm just going to change the first one. Well, Socrates does. Protagoras embraces HT. Many others do not. Now what's the case here? So in the first one we had false for everyone, but what if he does embrace it and many others don't? Well, what does HT actually say? That the belief or what's true for the person is what is the case for the person is true for that person. And so Socrates says, well, in this case, Protagoras, on the basis of HT, what does he have to hold? Well, that others who hold that HT are wrong that what others hold is true. And so Socrates, on the basis of saying HT or holding HT, has to hold that what others hold is true. And what do others hold? That HT is false. So if you think about it, says Socrates, that if Protagoras really accepts his own doctrine, then on the basis of his doctrine, he has to accept that what others basically hold about it is true, namely that the doctrine is false. And with this kind of odd little sleight of hand, and this is like not just others, but many others. So if we take that same little wee sleight of hand that was done here, is that once again, we'd have to say that HT is false on this sort of majoritarian view of what deciding what's true. So in both cases, HT turns out to be false. One, on the direction where nobody embraces it, and the other one, when it's even embraced by Socrates, it turns out in the end, or Socrates says even if it's embraced by Protagoras, in the end, it's going to have to be false. So you might be thinking, oh, there seems to be some funny stuff going on here. And you're right, there is some odd stuff to trying to understand this, because remember, Protagoras didn't say there was a thing, so that's just some problems. That's what I said earlier. Keep in mind there's all kinds of problems with this discussion. The main idea makes sense, which is basically trying to get the peritrope up and running, which is to get Protagoras' relativism to turn on itself and cause difficulties for itself. But one of the problems is this, shall we say, this kind of shift. Remember, Protagoras didn't have a notion of truth in the absolute sense. From, shall we say, absolute truth, or sometimes you can say as truth simpliciter, to okay, so from no absolute truth or truth simpliciter. Remember, it was all relative. Remember earlier on, it was Protagoras always saying truth is relative to the individual. If it's localized absolute, it's absolutely true for me, and your truth is absolutely true for you. To this, so getting away from no absolute truth and just relative to an actual absolute truth, or truth simpliciter. So going from none of that to holding it. What was that on the basis of? Well, it seems to be on this basis of, having this majoritarian view. So the shift seems to be based on a majority kind of view. That seems to be quite questionable. right, as to what's going on. Is that really what Protagoras was thinking? And that you're talking about making something absolutely true just on the basis of votes or how many people hold something? You can shift from, this notion of here where there's one person who's embracing it and many others don't, to it's false for everyone. That seems to be a bit of a little kind of trick. So once again, this is a problematic argument. That is just one sort of start to digging into it. The literature is voluminous on this, but I can't say that it's been decided in any way. Some philosophers would say that the whole aspect of moving, so just a little bit of a wrap up here. So from HT down to the to denying Q that I showed in the previous video, some people would say that ultimately is not truly valid. Socrates hasn't really established that. So is it valid or invalid? Does the peritrope really work? Well, structurally it seems okay, but on the other hand, is it really the case that this is going to hold? So maybe there's even problems with it in terms of its structure. But again, I think one of the, as I'm trying to pull back and give the big picture, another way to think about it is think of the peritrope as analogous to something like someone who says this. Imagine that Protagoras is what he's really trying to say to us is, look, at the end of the day, so here's another way. And again, it's as simple. And I'm going to use a kind of analogy. What seems we could think of as going on here is if someone says, there is no truth, right? Sort of this, if there's no real truth or no objective truth or whatever, there's no real truth. Well, you can clearly say, well, if I label this as Z, sentence Z, the question is you can see where this is going to go. If there is no truth, is Z true? Does Z apply to itself? It seems very problematic and self-defeating if you say there's no truth at all except this one, right? Is that it? Is that the only truth? Is that there is no truth? Well, in this case, what you can say is that this sort of global attack or global relativism is ultimately self-defeating. So there would there's something that's non-relative. To even state relativism, right? Here's another way to think of it. To even state the theory, you have to either deny that the theory applies to everything or in some way localize it. In other words, the theory can't apply to everything. It can't be complete, right? This couldn't be a complete sentence. It couldn't be a completely applicable sentence because it would have to include itself in its domain of applicability, and it would have to be, if it's correct, then it would have to be wrong. So this whole idea of trying to find the grounds of a theory being self-refuting or self-defeating, think of that as the more serious attack, the essence of the more serious attack. So our first example of the more serious attack is this peritrope, and I drew the analogy after going through this with the notion of a sentence that seems to attack itself if you regard it as applying it to itself. And what we're going to see in a later video is precisely another way of using this kind of self-refuting or self-defeating to have Protagoras attack himself. But we'll see that in a later video, so stay tuned for that.